Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Power Arc. Today, we are continuing our journey to looking into the lore of Dungeons and Dragons. Today, we are reacting to The Rise and Fall of the Elves by Mr.Rhexx. Yeah, let's get into it. Uh, Elves did some heinous stuff last time to the dragons. Uh, Made it to where they can't ever have a society ever again. Uh, I'm stealing elements of that for my campaign. Uh, the middle boss is of my campaign, so I'm trying to get rid of that comment. Oh, fun times. Anyways, continuing on, the rise and fall of the elves. Let's get into it.
On this short series, we're covering the history of the Forgotten Realms. We're going through the very beginning of history when the world was encapsulated on an ice age to the current times in the world's timeline, which for now appears to be 1492 DR. On our last video, we started at around minus 35,000 DR, covering the rise of many civilizations from the Rocks to the Batrashi to the rise and fall of both giants and dragons. And today, we're going to start with the rise and dominion of the elves, who precipitated the destruction of the draconic civilization by utilizing their powerful and unrestrained access to magic. However, before we do that, just wanted to take some time here to ask that if you like the content, to please check out my PDF store where I have some really cool D&D supplements that I know will improve your game dramatically. It's
I'm gonna go check that out.
Mr.Rhexx.store. Any purchase you make directly supports me and lets me continue making these videos. Videos like this one are much harder to make, require a lot of research, and tend to be longer than my usual stuff. Further, they typically tend to get less views, I guess because they're inherently more nerdy. So any support that you can give for the channel, it's always greatly appreciated. And as you know, my Kickstarter was funded a couple of months ago, and I have been hard at work writing Sands of Doom, a full 5th edition campaign for characters level 1 to level 11. It's a fairly gritty adventure. It's something a bit more serious than what you tend to see from Wizards of the Coast. It's inspired by Red Hand of Doom, one of the greatest adventures ever made for Dungeons & Dragons. In Sands of Doom, a massive army of 30,000 undead gnolls are marching towards the tiefling city of Karat, and players have to figure out how to empower themselves, weaken the enemy, or support the city so that when the siege begins, players have a chance at stopping the tide. We got some really sick art currently in the works for it. I'm endeavoring to make all of the battle maps be hand-drawn. Always a big fan of supporting artists, and it just grants a lot more personality to the world. If you want to support me, support the channel, or you love the idea of a gritty campaign set in a desert environment, which we haven't really gotten at all in 5th edition, then please consider pre-ordering Sands of Doom. You can either go to the Kickstarter page and click the pre-order button, or you can simply click the link in the video description. If you want more information about the Sands of Doom campaign, I recommend checking out the funded Kickstarter. It has all of the information you want, including all of the 6 stretch goals that we unlocked. But yeah, thank you guys so much for your support. Of course, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, that goes without saying. But okay, now on to the video.
Acting is just a means to get closer to the truth about I.
Okay.
The creation of the Draco Rage mythal obliterated the draconic civilization, one of the cruelest curses ever unleashed upon any group of people so far. There is another curse.
Hold up, you said so far? What? What could be worse than what happened to the dragons? So I need you to explain it now. Obviously, I can't. It's not yet happened.
Which we will talk about later, though ironically it was also unleashed by the elves. The Draco Rage mythal was a permanent magical effect tied to an asteroid which drove all dragons mad when the asteroid showed itself upon the sky. It was so effective that it alone destroyed the Draconic Empire. The rage forced dragons to consume their children, to destroy their cities, to fight their own allies, to throw themselves into murder and mayhem. A tragedy that perhaps could have been overcome if not for the fact that this was not just a one-time effect. every single time the comet would pass through the planet, the Draco Rage would activate, ensuring the dragons would never own dominion over any kingdom, any city, or really hold any true gatherings forevermore. The dragons fought this, of course. A massive draconic attack was delivered onto the ritual site where the spell was originally cast, but thanks to the sacrifice of the Avarial, known as the Winged Elves, the dragons could not push through until it was too late. The spell took effect, but at a great cost. The Avarial, who would have normally been as populous as the rest of Elvenkind, were effectively driven too close to extinction, as every man, woman, and child fought for the protection of the Mythal. Then after that, one last-ditch effort was made by the Draconic Empire to dismantle this powerful magical curse, while they devised a spell that would send a ray of destruction directly towards the comet, in hopes of shattering the star itself. This was the brightest minds within the Draconic civilization gathering every bit of sorcerous power they had and putting it onto this one destructive spell. And the spell did work, though unfortunately for them, they missed. The dragons missed the comet and instead ended up striking the moon. The moon was blasted with tremendous magical power, shattering an enormous chunk of its edge and splintering it into pieces. Pieces that from that moment on would continue orbiting the planet right behind the moon itself. This we can see even to this day. Every adventurer that plays in the Forgotten Realms, you right now who are playing in Storm King's Thunder or Waterdeep Dragon Heist, when you look up onto the moon, you will see a small collection of asteroids that follow the moon. The moon is called Saloon, and the asteroids are called the Tears of Saloon. What you see there in the night sky are the last memories of the ancient.
How they missed? How the fuck you miss? The what? That dragons didn't even try. Damn.
Ancient Draconic kingdom that existed 25,000 years ago. Quote, "In the desperate hope that another of Athgorath's children might chance upon my remains and seek what I have found, I now reveal my most precious piece of knowledge. The hills of the seven lost gods are not what they first seem. Each of the 7 rings of standing stones date back to the last days of the reign of dragons, when the elder worms sought to reverse what the elves had wrought. My ancestors tried to focus the weave into a weapon of unparalleled might that could shatter the drifting stars into clouds of rubble in the heavens above. But they scored only a glancing blow on the moon that circles our world, leaving only a string of tears and an inland sea to mark their failure. Now reason is once again undone by rage, and all that dragons have wrought crumbles slowly into dust." End quote.
Hate seeing ads? It's almost 2025. You don't have to anymore. The internet is almost unusable.
Damn, the dragons got royally fucked over. They couldn't even save themselves. Damn.
The annihilation of the dragons and the slow crumble of the giant empire in the north allowed for the quick proliferation of the elves into the mainland in this new age that we call the First Flowering. This age starts at minus 24,000 DR, and the elves will experience unprecedented prosperity, power, and hegemony for a staggering amount of time. Other than some minor small confrontations between elves, there are no recorded major events from the beginning of their settling until about 7,000 years after. So it is 7,000 years of relative peace that the world gets from this time. But it's also worth noting that 7,000 years being a lot of time is really mostly from a human's point of view, since in theory, 7,000 years is about 90 human lifetimes, but it's only like 9 elvish lifetimes. Things get interesting when you think about years in this way, because then you notice that the entirety of the Dawn Ages, when the giants and the dragons held dominion, that only spanned about 6,000 years, which is about 2 lifetimes for some of the more long-lived dragons. In any case, many big and influential...
Did they even get like a dynasty going? They got two kings, and fuck, the dragons are dead.
Elvish kingdoms were created during these 7,000 years. You have the Gold Elf Kingdom of Arivandar that was settled on what is nowadays the High Forest, a Moon Elf Kingdom of Ardeep around where the green fields are located now, a Dark Elf Kingdom called Ilithir scattered throughout what is nowadays the Shar and the Forest of Amtar. We have a Gold and Moon Elf Kingdom called Siorpir, and I'm sorry about these pronunciations, these are very elvish looking names. But these guys were located in present-day Ankwood and Condlewood. We have the Kingdom of Illifarm, who settled around present-day Ardeep and Cryptgarden Forest, alongside many parts of the Discern Valley. Then there's the Orishar Kingdom by nowadays Duskwood and parts of the Shar. There is Thiarnitar, which is what is Thornwood today. There is Yeller by Winterwood. We have Mieritar by what is now today the High Moor and Misty Forest. And then lastly, we have the Kingdom of Keltolmir, which is what is present-day Tethir, Amd, Erlasar, and Kalimshan. But then at about minus 17,600 DR, hundreds of high mages assembled into the heartland of Faerun at the Gathering Place. In here, they convoked the most powerful magic that has ever been made. It's called Ever Sakatin, also known as the Sundering, and it was a high magic spell designed to create the prophesized holy home of the elves. This is at a time when the hubris of the elves was at their peak. They literally, not figuratively, but literally wanted a piece of heaven on this world that they could live in. We know that the actual casting of the spell involved 13 high mages, 12 of which would funnel their energies into the spell, and then you would have one central mage who would direct it. We know that the Dark Elves were not invited to participate, since at this point in time, there was a lot of animosity between the Gold Elves and the Dark Elves, and the Gold Elves had a lot of political power in the northern sections of the continent where the ritual was being prepared. And that is also compounded by the fact that not every elf wanted this spell to be cast in the first place, since many figured that the results would be catastrophic, and it is believed that many of the Dark Elves opposed the casting of the spell in the first place, whereas the Gold Elves were the ones that were suggesting it in the first place. But anyways, now this spell was so powerful that we don't even know today the full extent of its power and reach. We know that the land was sundered, with enormous pieces of the continent being erected out from the ground and then flung out towards the sea in order to build this magical island that the elves desired. We know that a piece of Arvandor, the heaven of the elves, was taken and deposited alongside the island. And we know that the Seldarine, which is the name for the elvish pantheon of gods, actually approved of this spell being cast. And in fact, the spell would have failed if it wasn't for the intervention of the elvish goddess of the Sun Elves in particular would reach to even greater heights, as Gold Elves have historically always been elitist and arrogant. They've always seen themselves as superior.
So Gold Elves are Sun Elves. Do they become High Elves?
Even to the other elves. At least back then, this mentality was rampant during the height of the Arivandar kingdom of the Sun Elves. And with this hubris, they would start the chain of events that would lead into what eventually will become the downfall of the entire species. And they would do this through the annexation of the neighboring kingdom of Mieritar. You see, Mieritar was formed by groups of green elves and moon elves that were disillusioned with the way that the sun elves were running things in their kingdom of Arivandar. And as they left and formed this new kingdom, it started to flourish in such a degree that it was starting to outshine the sun elf kingdom where they originally came from. In fact, by about 4,000 years after the Sundering, Meritar had become the center of elven art and high magic in the entire continent. It all started with Arivandar attempting to peacefully annex Meritar using their political power. But then it further escalated into trade interferences between the two when the peaceful annexation just wasn't happening, which finally erupted into a straight-up invasion by Arivandar into Meritar, which concluded with Meritar being militarily occupied and forcefully annexed. There were also further threats at the time made by the Sun Elf Kingdom to another neighbor, the Kingdom of Chantel Othurier, basically threatening them to either join this Arivandar new forming empire or suffer a similar fate of annexation. Now, this invasion and annexation of Meritar we call the First Crown War, which will start a series of wars collectively called the Crown Wars, which basically forms the next era of the Forgotten Realms, and it lasts for a total of 3,000 years. So the Dark Elves at the time already very much not in favor of how the Sun Elves had been running things, basically declared war on the Sun Elves and their kingdom at this point. However, the kingdom of the Sun Elves was all the way in the north, and the kingdom of the Dark Elves was all the way in the south. And so it was supposed to be a battle strictly between two empires. Instead, it became the Second Crown War, which was the Dark Elves effectively just denouncing the Sun Elves and then attacking anyone who politically, economically, or militarily sided with the Sun Elves. Thankfully, we do have an official map for these wars, which is amazing, and this is the one right here. So here is the Illithir Empire, the kingdom of the Dark Elves, and what they did was they invaded and quickly conquered Orishar, who at the time was a major trade partner to the Sun Elves. Then the Illithir completely destroyed Siorpir using magical fire, which at the time would have been likely considered very much taboo because of the type of destruction that those magics create in the type of architecture that elves prefer, which of course is heavy in wood. In particular, they tactically burned out the entire frontier between Siorpir and its neighbors so that they couldn't get any help. The elvish realms of Thiarnitar and Yeller banded together to declare war on the Illithir, claiming that they were fearing more the brutal tactics of the Dark Elves and their use of fire to create wanton destruction, more so than they feared the colonizing mentality of the Sun Elves on the north. And so they invaded the lands of the Illithir, however they failed, and more than half of their forces were destroyed, claiming that the Dark Elves were using corrupt magic, though the nature of what this magic was or where it came from at this point in time was still unknown. Then Illithir took over Elir using the same tactics of spreading fire in order to separate armies and prevent reinforcements, destroying miles and miles of forests. It is actually, by the way, why nowadays when you look at a map of the Forgotten Realms, you actually see that there's a lot less forests, especially where these kingdoms were located. So much of that was just annihilated by the Dark Elves. Now, at this point in time, you have to understand too that Meritar, far in the north, wasn't fully conquered yet. There were bastions of resistance still, cities that were still not fully taken, and so for all intents and purposes, there was still a war in the north, which, seemingly was prompting the Dark Elves to be brutal in their approach, since presumably they wanted to reach the north and help Meritar as fast as they could. Again, Meritar was one of the kingdoms here at this time epoch that held a large amount of Dark Elves. And so it was sort of like an emblem, a symbol of Dark Elves sort of superiority, or at least might and prestige. And so it completely getting taken over by the Sun Elves was just like a very personal insult to them. But after the fall of Yeller is when Meritar becomes fully conquered. And this is when things start to get dark, when the Dark Elves start delving deeper into brutality and, well, evil. When the Dark Elves of the Illithir Empire conquer Thiarnitar, it does so using enslaved monsters and undead, some of which were dragons that had been mind-controlled and enslaved. And it does this in spite of the fact that the war in the north was already far over. And this conquering of Thiarnitar effectively ended the Second Crown War. Now, a couple of notes here. It is at this point in time when many elves who were seeking peaceful lands, or just generally a place to avoid all the war and bloodshed that had been happening all around the place, they started to abandon the mainland in order to go out onto the sea. And so this would be the time when we would start to see a lot of sea elves, many of which choose to live on the islands that we now call the Moonshays, and some of which start living underwater. This is also the time when some of the first mind flayers would start making their way over onto this planet. These mind flayers would come from a planet on the solar system called Glyth, which is the 6th planet from the sun. They travel to the planet Toril here and form a massive city called Orindol underground. But anyways, back to the elves. There's about 300 years or so of, I wouldn't call it peace, but rather reconstruction of forces, replanning, Cold War style preparations. This stalemate is then broken by the Sun Elves, who finally decide to invade Chantel Othrier, using the same script as before. Basically, they try to peacefully annex using politics, but when that failed, they would then resort to threats and then eventually war. This is what begins then the Third Crown War, which lasts for another 300 years before Arivandar, the kingdom of the Sun Elves, conquers Chantel Othrier. But then something weird happens. We call it the Dark Disaster. Meritar is engulfed in killing storms. Quote, regardless of which elf did what to whom, the killing storms known by elves as the Dark Disaster were summoned over Meritar 1,000 years after the first Vishan noble walked among its wooded glades as a conqueror. The Dark Disaster lasted for months, and when its cloying black and olive mists and ichor-choked rains finally dissipated, the One Sprout realm stood revealed as an open, poisoned, and blasted plain instead of a forest. While many of the folk of Meritar fled far before the killing storm, many innocents died in its fell wake. 90 Dark Elf wizards and a trio of high mages of Meritar chose to face it and fight. What became of them is lost, for they headed to the heart of the storm a month after its origin, seeking the place of power where they could cast a counterspell against the storm. Like all else within the storm's envelope, there was naught left behind to find but ash and ichor. End quote. It was clear to all elf that the Killing Storm was a high magic spell, but whoever had casted it and for what purpose is still unknown to this day. There are two possible culprits, or at least I would say out of all of the theories, two stand out the most. The most popular theory is that the Sun Elves did it, whether it was because they were losing control of the kingdom, or perhaps they were testing a spell that they wanted to use against the Dark Elves and then backfired, or was maybe stronger than anticipated, is unknown. The other culprit could be resistance fighters within the kingdom who were attempting a spell that they could use against their oppressors, but again, backfired and then consumed them all. Regardless of who did it, it only took 3 months for the storms to destroy the entire kingdom, and what was left is what we now today recognize as the High Moor. This entire section here was forest, and one of the most powerful kingdoms of high magic and art that have ever existed in this world, and now this swamp is what was left. Meritar was, of course, a kingdom of dark and green elves, and of course, the reason why the Dark Elves had gone to war with the Sun Elves in the first place was because of this. And so, as of its destruction and the growing sentiment that the Sun Elves had done the high spell that had caused it, we see now the beginning of the Fourth Crown War. Finally, an actual confrontation between these two major powers. Now, the lore describes the Dark Elves at this point in time as seething from the destruction of Meritar, and at this point, at minus 10,450 DR, we got to see for the first time the truth of the corrupt magic that the Dark Elves had been using. It had seemed that the Dark Elves were convoking the power of mythical elvish deities that were forbidden. The peculiarities of the elvish deific pantheon land beyond the scope of this video, but know that one of the most powerful goddesses in the elvish pantheon betrayed Corellon Larithian, the patriarch of the pantheon, as she, who at the time was his wife, attempted to kill him to usurp his position. Now, that didn't work, and she was banished alongside a few other gods who sided with her. In this timeline, this would have happened around 20,000 years before all of these crown wars. Now, it is unclear whether the Dark Elves knew exactly who they were praying to or who was giving them their power. There are some sources that claim that they only knew them as some form of spider goddess alongside a small group of small deities that shared the sympathy of the Dark Elves. But of course, in reality, they were praying to this betrayer, a goddess named Lolth that had been banished from the Elvish pantheon, a goddess that was now a demon lord. Now, out of all of the other profane deities that they were praying to, there was also Gaunadar, who took a very explicit role in corrupting the Dark Elves, and that's exactly what happened. The Dark Elves started to become corrupted by these evil deities. Lolth and Ganadar were using the civil strife between the elves as a way to ingratiate themselves onto the Dark Elves and use their anger and perhaps a genuine desire to help Meritar as a way to corrupt them. And so during this Fourth Crown War is when you started to see demons being summoned by the Illithir. It's also likely that from the perspective of the Dark Elves, they had seen what the Gold Elves had potentially wrought upon Meritar with those killing storms, and they were afraid that the same thing would happen to them, which would further force their hand into committing grievous taboos in order to get the power that they needed to end the war in their favor. All in all, the war would last for another 450 years, and it would be an extremely bloody affair, as some of the lore suggests that the Dark Elves were actually winning, but it's a bit unclear, and we do know that most of Chantal Authrier was almost completely burned to the ground by the enslaved dragons and demons that the Dark Elves had been using. And so at this point, after basically hundreds of years of conflict, the general sentiment between all of the different elves started to shift, between who was good and who was evil. The atrocities of the Gold Elves and the fact that they had started this entire conflict in the first place was quickly being forgotten. And in its stead, everyone started to point their fingers at the Dark Elves who were using demons and fire and undead and of course now slaves, which was not an elvish thing at all to do. And what resulted was
Strange. Okay. Because most depictions I've seen of elves, that is something that they would do. So, okay.
A miraculous collection of priests and high mages, and most likely hundreds of thousands of citizens, to gather in some of the more neutral kingdoms in order to pray to the elvish gods for salvation. And the gods responded. Brutally responded. By channeling his power through his clerics, Corellon Larithian used an extremely powerful high magic spell that cursed every single Dark Elf. The corrupted ones who were summoning demons and burning the forests, the soldiers that fought on the front lines, the priests that were healing the wounded, the druids that were taking care of the woods, the children that played in the parks, the very same clerics that had prayed for salvation originally, and even the unborn that still hadn't had a chance to life. Every
Is this curse going to be the curse that you were talking about earlier that was worse than the ones that happened to the dragons? You at?
Come with me and you'll be
single Dark Elf, innocent or guilty, was cursed by Corellon Larithian. This immediately ended the Fourth Crown War and caused what we now call the Descent of the Drow. The curse had both physical marks but also metaphysical ones. What do I mean? Well, physically, the Dark Elves were cursed with an aversion to the sun, which forced them to abandon their lives and kingdoms and instead seek salvation within the dark confines of the Underdark, a collection of labyrinthine cave systems that existed under the ground. But further, the curse also became something of a deific decree, effectively severing the Dark Elves from the rest of their brethren in a deep philosophical way, like their souls were no longer united as brothers. Now they were something entirely different. For example, elves do not need to sleep. Instead, they meditate. And when an elf meditates, especially when they're young, so before they reach 100 years of age, they see glimpses of the elvish heaven, Arvandor. But further, meditating brings peace and tranquility. It brings calmness to the mind of an elf. This, in some ways, was a gift by Corellon to his children, but a gift that was taken from the Dark Elves. From this moment on, when Dark Elves' trance is just silence and darkness. Further, the name
That hurts. Damn.
De Rao was given to them, meaning traitor in Elvish, which inevitably over time shortened to simply Drow, which is what they're now called today. After the cursing and subsequent banishment of the now Drow from the surface, the Elvish gods then summoned a great meeting of all of the Elvish leaders from all across the continent to form peace amongst the elves. In these conversations, it was then decreed that the ones guilty for starting this conflict were indeed the Sun Elves from the kingdom of Arivandar, and so, with one last divine command, many of the neutral smaller kingdoms of the elves banded together to form one last fifth crown war to bring the Sun Elves, who had perpetrated all of these crimes, to justice. The war, alongside many revolts from the Sun Elf kingdoms, led to the swift and decisive fall of Arivandar. And this puts us at minus 9,000 DR, or about 10,500 years before the present time. And the dissolution of Arivandar also marks the end of the era now known as the Crown Wars, and also marks the beginning of a new era called the Founding Time, which signals the rise of all kinds of humanoid civilizations, including the first big human civilizations. But of course,
Okay.
I will have to leave that to our next video. From now on, though, I will start speeding a bit more through the timeline because we will start now seeing many different civilizations rise in many different parts of the continent. And one, it is just unfeasible for me to cover all of them on this series, but also two, not every event and frankly not every civilization is ultimately important to fully understand the history of Toril. For example, throughout all of this time, the dwarves have expanded through multiple locations in the Underdark and will become embattled in wars with the Drow. A clan of dwarves will be, of course, famously conquered by the Mind Flayers, and from those dwarves, the Duergar will form. Further, there are many battles between the Sea Elves and the Sahagin currently happening under the sea, but those battles, those events are not really world-changing events, and I only have so much time. So from now on, know that we are done with what one might call the mythical ages of the planet, and we are getting closer to the present day. Very exciting.
We raised over $140,000 via Kickstarter. Fans around the world fell in love with it.
Thank you guys so much for watching. A reminder, if you want to support the channel, please do check out my online PDF store, Mr.Rhexx.
Okay. So, that curse was not as bad as the one for the dragons, which means that curse is still about to happen. Oh, the Dark Elves got fucked over, bro. The part of them, like, all elves before they reach 100 years old, when they sleep, they see heaven. And now the dark elves can't see heaven when they sleep. That's fucked up. Imagine being a dark elf that you're 90 years old. And every single night, that's the best part of your day, because they're in constant war right now. Is sleeping and you see heaven. You're innocent because you're 90 years old for Ellis. You're still a child. Then one day you go to sleep, you don't see heaven no more. You never see heaven again. That's fucked. Oh, that's also the first set of Crown Wars, or the first. That's Crown Wars. Those are the flowering. So there's a second flowering, and there's a second sundering. Damn. Okay. Jesus Christ. That's a lot to take in and stuff. That gives me stuff to think about for my campaigns going forward. Yeah. Fuck, guys. I don't know how to end this. Links to the original video will be in the description below. Be sure to check that out. Check out Mr.Rhexx's video. Fuck. Sun elves are fucking ass elves too. Also, fucking working with demons. Why? Damn. I would understand working with devils. The devils more. Working with devils more than demons, because demons just wants to destroy everything, bring everything to chaos. At least the devils, you can make deals with them, and they will abide by their deals to the T, to the letter. Demons, they don't care. Oh, it's a good video. Great. Most of the way through the timeline now of D&D. Fuck the everything about what happened to the Dark Elves, being tricked into following Loth, and then suffering from it. Damn, that sucks ass. Again, link to the original video will be in the description below. Be sure to check that out. Mr.Rhexx worked really hard on this stuff. While you're down there, be sure to give me a like and subscribe. And comment down below what you would like to see me react to in the future. Until next time, guys, I've been John, and I'll be seeing you.